right, looks like we have a good group, so I think we can go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar on finding a fair approach to clean energy siting. Before we begin, I'm just going to go over some housekeeping. There are two ways to engage during today's presentation. Please use the chat box for any commentary or support, and we also would love for you all to introduce yourselves in the chat so we all know who's in the virtual room with us. And then we will be using the Q&A box for questions during our Q&A session and discussion towards the end. So please remember to submit any questions here, as it's going to be a little bit harder for us to keep track of the chat for those questions. The presentation today is going to be recorded, so if you would like to rewatch it and share it with your networks, there will be a link to the recording sent in a follow-up email. And with that, I will go ahead and introduce our speakers today, and I'll start with myself. I am Natalie Monitius. I'm a senior associate at Clean Air Task Force. CATF is a global nonprofit organization working to safeguard against the worst impacts of climate change by catalyzing the rapid development and deployment of low carbon energy and other climate protecting solutions. We also have Sarah Mills with us. Sarah is the director for the Center for Empowering Communities and an associate professor of practice at the University of Michigan. The Center for Empowering Communities harnesses the expertise at the University of Michigan to support communities across the urban-rural spectrum as they leverage decarbonization opportunities to advance their goals and enhance their quality of life. And we're also joined by Nelson Falkenberg, who is a siting policy manager at Clean Tomorrow. Clean Tomorrow is a bipartisan nonprofit organization that advances policies that reduce climate emissions by turning policy ambition into action. Clean Tomorrow's Siting Solutions Project conducts rigorous analysis and stakeholder engagement to identify the most promising siting policies to maximize the benefits of clean energy for communities, for the environment, and for the electric grid. All right, and I'm going to give a quick look over of today's event. We're going to start with a presentation from Nelson, who's going to give us the lay of the land of siting policy, including what it is, how these policies are structured, and what trends we've seen in recent years. Then Sarah is going to walk us through what a fair share approach to siting policy might look like. After that, I'll share a bit about where we've seen this kind of approach in policy in other fields and what we can learn from the decades that they've been in place. And then I'll walk us through some considerations for how we might begin to think about how we develop the mechanics and what this fair share policy idea could look like in different states. And then finally, we're saving the last 20 minutes for a Q&A discussion. So please remember to add your questions to the Q&A feature throughout the presentation, and we will do our best to answer them all. And just before we dive into the presentation from Nelson, I want to share this question that we are hoping will center our presentation and discussion for today. It is, how do we develop state siting and permitting policies that balance local interests with state and national need for clean energy deployment? And with that, I will hand it over to Nelson to get us started.
Great, thanks, Natalie. Thanks for the intro, and thanks for having me on this panel. I'm really excited to be here. I'm going to start off by talking about some quick one-on-one on siting policy. Siting policy refers to who permits which projects, where, under which conditions, and the process for doing so. The who part of this refers to which government entity has authority over decision-making. If it's the state, then it's typically a utility commission or a siting board. If it's the local government, then it may be individual counties, townships, and municipalities. And then the process element here mostly refers to the permitting aspect, how a project gets permission to be built. The map on the right here is from our report released in May and shows by state whether projects are primarily sited at the state, local, or level or through some hybrid approach. And I just want to point out a couple of little trends here. States in the Northeast and Midwest tend to take several approaches to siting, but often include some aspect of a state siting authority. On the flip side, states in the Southeast and Southwest tend to take more of a local government or hybrid state-local approach. And then finally, as you can see from this map, it's really messy. There's a lot of variance between states, and states often use a combination of approaches. So let's dive a little deeper into this. Next slide, please. This is Citing Policy 201. The table on the right is pulled from the same May report and describes the different policy frameworks for citing projects across a spectrum of state and local authorities. We identified 15 different policy frameworks and sorted states into each. At the top of this table, you have predominantly state citing, and at the bottom, minimal citing regulations, which refer to states where landowners hold most or all decision-making power over which projects may be built. Most commonly, a state will have distinct permitting processes for small and large projects. That's called contingent authority. In other cases, a state may have multiple permitting pathways available to local governments or developers, regardless of project size. That's where the hybridity comes in with things like opt-in, opt-out, backstops, etc. State guardrails allow local governments to retain principal citing authority, but subject to restrictions enacted by the state legislature. Finally, it's crucial to point out that states implement their policies in distinct ways, and apparently equivalent policy in law may have very different implications for project development in practice. We include detail on each of these policy frameworks, including considerations and case studies in our report. Next, we'll discuss some challenges facing existing citing policy approaches. Next slide, please. So what's the problem? Under the current paradigm, in many states, wind, solar, and batteries are becoming increasingly hard to build. Back in February of last year, a USA Today study found that 15% of counties have effectively banned wind, solar, or both. This July, a study from Heat Map found that number had increased to 20% of counties. And we know these citing policies are having a profound effect on the industry. In the 5-year period between 2019 and 2024, 1/3 of projects were canceled. That equates to roughly 36 gigawatts of unrealized new electricity capacity, which is a huge number. The primary cause of those cancellations, as reported by developers in a 2024 LBNL survey shown here, is restrictive local ordinances, grid interconnection, and community opposition. Next slide, please. But why are counties adopting restrictive zoning ordinances or moratoriums on renewables? Well, it's not just NIMBYism. That's too simple a boogeyman, and local communities do have some legitimate concerns and face real challenges with citing renewable energy projects. So first, a couple challenges. Some of the local opposition that we see in counties is based on misinformation or disinformation, which often spreads through social media and is frequently pushed by fossil fuel interests. These are things like wind turbines causing cancer. So there's a network of misinformation out there. Second, local governments are resource constrained and reacting conservatively to pump the brakes by adopting moratoria or bans until they can figure out a solution to this new technology that's entering their community. And then there's some local pushback that is rooted in legitimate concerns for communities, including changes to the local character of the community, agricultural land being taken out of production, the localized environmental impacts like stormwater runoff, and the fact that communities aren't seeing the financial benefits of hosting in many cases. Plus, there have been a few rotten apples, aka bad developers, who are spoiling the bunch for everyone else. There's also a perceived lack of community engagement and public participation in the citing process, and a lack of transparency in the process, and a trust deficit with developers. So we'll come back to all of these challenges again when we talk about principles for policy design, but we really believe that good policy can help solve for a lot of these issues and address local citing challenges and state citing challenges. So next slide, please. So citing reform is now a really hot topic at state legislatures. The uptick in renewable energy development and increasing energy demand, coupled with the expansion of local restrictions and the rise in local opposition, among a lot of other factors, means state legislatures are now grappling with renewable energy citing. We tracked and analyzed bills related to wind, solar, and battery storage citing during the 2025 legislative session across the US. And between January and the end of June 2025, when most legislatures are wrapping up their sessions, we identified more than 300 renewable energy citing and permitting related bills introduced in 47 states. The results of our tracking and research is summarized in our report, the State of Siting 2025 Legislative Roundup, and we'll highlight a few takeaways for you all. So, like I mentioned, we assess the potential impact of bills and categorize them on a spectrum between very restrictive and very permissive when it comes to renewable energy deployment. The most startling and stark finding was that there were more than twice as many restrictive bills introduced as permissive ones. And that's what this graph on the right is showing here. Here's a few other findings from our report, and I'll rattle through these. Restrictive policy approaches are gaining momentum in states with large amounts of clean energy deployment. That's Oklahoma, Texas, Arizona, and others. And then recent permissive reforms are under attack in states like Michigan, New York, Illinois, and Washington. Republican lawmakers also introduced many more and more restrictive bills than their Democrat colleagues, but we found that bipartisan bills were far more likely to advance and actually pass legislatures. Similarly, technology agnostic legislation was more likely to advance in states with at least one Republican chamber, but environmental advocates typically take issue with all of the above reforms. And then finally, non-traditional coalitions effectively blocked or limited the impacts of restrictive legislation in conservative states. Yeah, some really interesting groups of folks worked to make sure that these restrictive bills did not get across the finish line. So next slide, please. Despite all the introduced bills, very few actually passed in 2025. Only 1/10 of introduced legislation became law, so about 30 bills, most with a neutral impact. This map on the right shows restrictive legislation in orange and permissive legislation in purple, mostly broke even. Interestingly, the states that passed siting bills are all trifecta states, whether permissive or restrictive, all trifectas. And that may reflect both how hard it is to pass legislation in non-trifecta states. States with split governments just don't tend to pass as many bills, and the lack of policy nuance and middle ground on this particular topic of renewable energy siting. So I'm going to kind of glaze over this quickly because we could talk about this for an hour, but I'll tell you a little bit of detail about what passed. Indiana, Ohio, and Oregon all passed siting legislation with modest benefits for clean energy deployment, improving permitting processes or timelines. And then legislators in Texas, Oklahoma, Arizona, and Arkansas, and Louisiana were all very busy trying to restrict clean energy deployment and scored a few minor victories. And there were mixed results in Maryland and South Carolina. In 2026, we expect to see Colorado, Pennsylvania, Virginia, and Iowa advance permissive siting reforms. And we also expect to see restrictive siting reforms back on the table in Oklahoma, Arizona, and Michigan. Now, next slide, please. Unfortunately, there's no best policy and no silver bullet here. Obviously, Sarah and Natalie are going to talk to you about fair share, which I'm really excited about. But I just want to mention that what works well in Texas won't necessarily work in Massachusetts, and each policy really has to be tailored to the particular cultural and political context of the place. But even though there's no best policy, we think that there are some policy design principles that can lead to effective reforms. I'm not going to go through this list in detail, but these are some of the policy principles that we think can yield effective renewable energy siting policies. And we are fleshing out these policy principles, plus a menu of model policy frameworks to identify the best policy solutions to site renewables in a new report. And that report will be released hopefully next month. So if you're interested in this kind of work and understanding more about best policy principles, feel free to drop me a line and we'll make sure you have this report. So that's it for me. Thank you very much. And I look forward to your questions later. I'll pass it back to Natalie and Sarah.
Great. Thanks, Nelson. And I'm going to pick up where you left off in terms of that Venn diagram of the competing priorities that siting policy often tries to balance. And I would just say that like finding a good policy is hard. Like maybe it's just that I don't have amazing balance. very often we start talking about balancing state priorities for clean energy with local priorities about land use or quality of life that may be in conflict with each other. But that's not the only thing a good policy is trying to balance. It's also balancing the fact that urban centers have higher energy demand, but it's rural areas where renewables and particularly wind energy are much more viable. Um, and once you acknowledge that renewables want to go in rural areas, you realize that you have to balance energy and climate priorities with priorities related to agriculture or wildlife. And this is where solar actually makes things even more exciting or complicated. Another element that needs to be balanced is planning and deployment. So I am a planner and a firm believer in effective engagement. And I think that they're essential to good decisions, but at some point you have to have policies that allow you to deploy that infrastructure. You can't just be fixed into a planning cycle. And finally, I think finding a good policy is tricky because we know that there are economies of scale in renewables, but there may also be cumulative impacts, particularly when the technology isn't something that a community is thrilled about. If you go to the next slide, please, we'll talk about, so where do we see states overtly trying to do this balancing act? Well, I'll start with Michigan because it's the state that I know the best. In 2023, Michigan passed sweeping siting policy reform. When it was going through the legislature, it was House Bill 5120, but it's now known as PA 233, Public Act 233. And that law has a number of super unique elements. But the one that I want to draw your attention to in terms of this balancing act is that in Michigan, if developers choose to have the Public Service Commission review their application, the commission applies this standard, and I'm going to quote here. The impact of the proposed facility on local land use, including the percentage of land within the local government dedicated to energy generation. So no projects have been approved through the state level process yet. So we don't actually know how the commission will apply this standard, but I think it's a clear recognition that there may be a point when enough of the land area has energy generation that we can say maybe that community has done its fair share. The next state going clockwise around this graphic that I'll point you to is New Jersey. That is an example of striking an interesting balance specifically between energy and ag priorities. So New Jersey has a renewable portfolio standard, but it's also been a longtime leader in thinking about farmland preservation, largely given the intense development pressure around its metro areas. So it has a competitive solar incentive. And within that incentive, though, there's a cap on incentive eligibility for projects that are on ag lands. There's both a 2.5% caps statewide on these ag lands, as well as county level caps of 5% in each relevant county. Maryland has a similar approach, but it has tried to do this balance through a different mechanism. So this spring, the legislature passed the Renewable Energy Certainty Act, which was House Bill 1036. And that included a number of tweaks to siting practice policies within the state. One of these tweaks was to add a cap on solar development in priority ag preservation areas. And that cap is 5% of the land area in the county's PPA, which again is that priority preservation area. So that 5% county level cap matches sort of what is happening in New Jersey, even though what kind of lands qualify are different in each of those places. This 5% cap in Maryland applies to large projects that go through the state level siting process before the Maryland Public Service Commission. But it also applies for projects under 5 megawatts, which are sited at the local level. One of the changes in Maryland is that there are new guardrails for projects locally sited. However, those guardrails go away for land for solar that would be on these PPAs once 5% of the county's priority preservation lands have solar on them. So that's interesting that it applies to both the state and the local lands. Finally, I want to draw your attention to Virginia. In 2024, there was a whole bunch of legislative action in Virginia trying to find this balance. One of the bills that was proposed was pretty much a carbon copy of Michigan's law, including that percentage of land area provision. Another proposed bill would have stuck with local siting, but set guardrails that would go away once 4% of the land area in the locality is under solar panels. So something similar to the local provisions within Maryland. One of the concepts that was proposed followed what they called an equal pain principle, which was setting renewable energy targets for all planning regions in the state and then letting the regions develop plans and zoning consistent with those targets. At the end of the day, none of these passed, but like that equal pain principle in particular gets at the heart, I think, of what we call potentially a more positively named fair share policy. And that's on the next slide. So we wrote about this in a paper that came out this summer, and I hope we'll be able to put the link to it in the chat. But what we talked about and the way we define a fair share policy approach is one that aims to balance local and statewide interests by ensuring that all communities contribute to meeting state goals without any one community disproportionately bearing the burden of critical infrastructure. On the next slide, as we do in the paper, we lay out 5 core principles that we think characterize a fair share policy. And to be clear, these are principles that we see at play in somewhere in each of the 4 states that we just highlighted, but let me walk you through each of them. So the first principle is that communities can opt out after meeting that fair share. That's the heart of this. At some point, once they have made their contribution to the statewide goal, communities can say, we've done our parts. This could be done within the context of local zoning, since there is typically at least some constraint to local zoning authority. Sometimes there's a reasonableness standard. Effectively, you could incorporate a fair share to say you're being unreasonable if you don't allow projects to get built that get you up to your fair share. But it also works within the context of state zoning, where, like Maryland, the state can't approve projects if they tip the locality above its fair share. This leads to the second principle, though, because up until that point of meeting the fair share, the siting and permitting process should favor developers. It shouldn't be pulling teeth to get those projects permitted if the community has not yet met its fair share. This is exactly the move that Maryland made, which constrained local government's ability to restrict projects under the 5 megawatts until they hit that 5% cap. At the same time, we built into this principle the idea that it's not a developer free-for-all. There should be some reasonable standards in place to ensure that you have responsible development, to minimize what Nelson talked about, those kind of bad apples in kind of spoiling the bunch. The third principle that I want to talk about is that a fair share should apply to all regions, no exceptions. Our sense, and we write about this explicitly, is that if your region has a connection to the electricity grid, you have some responsibility in sustaining it. We know that there are regional differences in renewable potential, and there are certainly differences in urban and rural communities being able to host utility scale infrastructure. But a fair share policy would expect every region, and we don't go this far in the paper, but I'm going to go off script and say, I would say every community should contribute in some way. That might simply be requiring that homeowners associations that are most common in suburban communities allow rooftop and backyard solar, or that urban communities expedite or even incentivize distributed generation. This, I think, is where there's the biggest departure from other siting policy frameworks, which often only apply to the biggest projects, which means that in reality, it only applies to rural areas. I'm not expecting that every community would be expected to host the same amount of megawatts, or even that we're only talking in terms of renewable megawatts. It's possible to include into a fair share principle that energy efficiency in places with a lot of buildings, i.e., urban areas, counts. But my sense, our sense within a fair share policy framework is that every community should have to do something. The fourth principle in a fair share policy highlights the importance of planning, but also acknowledges that planning alone isn't going to get megawatts. In a fair share concept, energy modeling is going to be important, we think, to assigning fair share allocations and to determining what might be doable across the state. Once those allocations are made, though, once those allocations are made, planning can continue to be helpful to think about what sorts of projects and where within the community projects could go that would support local goals. For example, for economic development or for farmland income diversification. But planning shouldn't be used as a delaying tactic or holding or a means of holding out for the perfect project. Instead, actually, I would say it might identify the technologies that might make sense for the community to pursue even beyond their fair share. Our final principle on the next slide is one that I confess is very near and dear to my heart. And it's acknowledging that siting policy alone isn't the be all end all. And that in fact, we ought to be thinking about the web of state policies that can help incentivize cost-effective renewable energy. Some of you might know that I love talking about property taxes. Most property tax policies, though, are pretty linear, or in fact, they're based on infrastructure costs. And so larger projects, which do have some economies of scale, pay less to local governments on a per megawatt basis than smaller projects. If we flip this on its head, though, and instead use tax policy or other funding mechanisms to have larger projects be even more lucrative to local governments, I think we'll start to get local governments wanting to host more than their fair share of infrastructure. Similarly, if we're able to reduce the tax liability of smaller projects or change utility purchasing policies to make these projects more competitive, I think we might be able to change the system into one where there isn't as much of a cost barrier to incorporating power from these smaller scale projects. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Natalie.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sarah. I'm going to talk about some places where we've seen a similar policy approach before. So, fair share policies are not necessarily new. We've seen them in a few different domains. The one we're going to focus on here is in affordable housing. Since the 1960s, this policy approach has been used to incentivize the development of affordable housing. At the time, a lot of these earliest policies were emerging. There was a high prevalence of racial segregation and exclusionary zoning practices in urban and suburban communities that perpetuated disparities by income and limited upward mobility. So these fair share policies were often initially aimed to kind of offset that and to create more equal opportunity for folks. So since then, a number of states have adopted fair share policies for affordable housing. This includes California, New Jersey, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and Illinois. And the way that these policies are designed varies significantly across the states, and the mechanisms that they use also vary. I'm going to go over two examples here, but our paper does dive into, in the appendix, it dives into a lot of these in detail. So Massachusetts was one of the foundational policies that was passed in 1969. And here the state establishes a goal of 10% affordable housing or a cap of 1.5% of the land area in every community being affordable housing. They also create a process for streamlined permits through the Zoning Board of Appeals that sets strict deadlines on when those approvals happen. And if a project is denied for unreasonable reasons or reasons that make the project uneconomic with certain conditions, developers can appeal that decision through a state agency. But importantly, this is only the case if a municipality is not in compliance with that fair share goal of 10%. And there are other ways that these municipalities can also achieve a safe harbor status. So in Massachusetts, if they demonstrate that they've increased their affordable housing by about 1% in 12 months, then they are immune from these appeals processes as well. There's also a similar policy in place in Illinois, which I want to note because it's a state that has significantly more rural communities. So we've also seen this play out in states that are not necessarily as dense as Massachusetts. And then the other policy I want to highlight is New Jersey, which was established in 1975. And here the state develops obligations for the number of affordable units for each municipality. And it's developed through a formula that considers a range of different factors like available land to develop, existing housing stock, demographics, everything like that. And up until the obligation is met by the municipality, here there's a pathway through the courts where any interested party, not necessarily a developer, could bring a suit. And then the court could require that the locality authorize the development. And again, they can opt out of this developer's remedy process once their fair share obligation is met. So some of this might sound familiar to those who are involved in clean energy siting reform. It has a lot of the same goals as modern day clean energy siting reform. These policies aim to create faster approvals for projects. They also aim to limit bans or overly restrictive local regulations. They also aim to address the fact that this is an evolving land use, and many communities have not considered these or brought these into their regulations before. They also aim to address the fact or aim to consolidate approvals and streamline review processes. And they aim to allow local input, but they don't necessarily allow local veto power. And to be clear, these housing policies have not fully delivered on their promise. As we all know, we are in an ongoing housing crisis, but they also haven't necessarily been an abject failure. So now I'm going to go over some of the lessons that we've learned from the over 50 years that these policies have been in place. And I want to note that all of these have been validated through a convening that we hosted in the fall of last year with housing policy experts. So first, few communities actually meet their obligations, but many communities go from having no affordable housing to some, and the supply increases pretty steadily. Second, the progress takes time to kick in, but it does gain momentum. Next, these policies do endure. Many of them have been in place for 30 to 50 years. They've withstood political challenges, political changes, and ballot referendums, and rather than being repealed, they've been evolved to meet the current needs and challenges. These policies have also led to an increase in planning at local levels, and this is largely in part or due to the technical assistance increases that have come from states. As well, communities tend to initially resist new development. We know that from energy siting as well. But here we've seen a softening over time, in part due to these policies. And then, as I mentioned before, there is no uniform approach to these. The mechanisms vary based on the states. And then finally, market demand still matters. So even if a policy applies statewide, we still tend to see housing development occur where there is market demand for it. So our goal is to take some of these lessons and start to reinvent the wheel, if you will, and apply them back towards clean energy with a goal of making it a stronger and more impactful policy. But there are a few key differences that I'm sure you all are aware of that we need to acknowledge between clean energy and housing. First, we have very different starting points. Housing has always been, or predominantly always been, under local control, Whereas right now, as Nelson described earlier, clean energy policies vary, and there's a mixed bag of which states have fully local control or state control or somewhere in between. Next, clean energy projects tend to benefit more from economies of scale, as Sarah mentioned. So larger projects tend to be more favored than we see for housing developments. The footprint of these projects for clean energy are also much larger, or tend to be much larger than we see for affordable housing. And then this is a big one. Clean energy is more resource dependent. Some communities are more suitable, whereas housing can more likely be built anywhere. There's also a saturation point with this for clean energy projects, where a certain area may be more likely to have the landscapes become dominated by energy infrastructure. And then finally, the geographies are very different. Housing policies are really aimed at urban and suburban communities, while energy policies to date and energy development tends to more impact rural communities. And the politics also around these policies differs significantly. So with that in mind, there are a lot of things that we need to consider if we're going to start adapting and developing a fair share policy design for clean energy. And we know that there are a lot of detailed questions that we need to answer. Like, how do we define and measure what a fair share obligation is going to be? How is it going to account for resource differences? What technologies or non-technological solutions could be used to meet this mandate? How do we measure compliance? How do we make these processes more favorable for development? And then finally, is this viable in every state in the US? Is there even political will or appetite for it? And these are all really big questions. And we think a lot of them will need to be ironed out to meet the context of a specific state or region. So then rather than diving into all these specifics right now, we want to pose a few broader considerations for the group. The first one is, how could we apply these core principles to states in their own existing contexts? And how can we adapt these existing policies to build in these core principles? And how might we also develop new policies that could also be put in place in states that don't have a strong existing policy? So we don't necessarily think that we need to overhaul every existing policy that's in place, but we could make minor tweaks to make sure that all the fair share principles are incorporated. So with this in mind too, it also makes it difficult because states have so many different starting points to develop one model policy for fair share. That's not realistic. So perhaps we could develop two model policies. One where permitting authority is predominantly held at the local level, and one where the state level setting and permitting is more held at the state level. So then we would have two broad frameworks that we could then adapt and tweak to meet each state's context. And then finally, a fair share policy might not be the right answer for every place. And if it's not fair share, we encourage the group to think, how else can we develop a state siting and permitting policy that addresses these tensions, is durable, is impactful, and makes sure that everyone is involved and contributes to the clean energy transition? And I believe with that, we are ready to dive into some discussion. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and get reoriented. I'll have all the panelists come back on camera, see everyone's lovely faces, and then we'll go ahead and start to dive into some of these questions. And I also want to send a reminder, if you aren't adding questions to the Q&A feature, please be sure to do so, and we'll dive into them. All right, so we do have a pre-submitted question that I want to make sure we get to first. It is, what recommendations do you have for states with home rule? And so that where it defaults to local control. Sarah, do you want to kick us off with this one?
Sure. I tried to weave it into what I said a little bit, but I would say, again, usually in those states, and I can speak from the Michigan specific example. Michigan's Zoning Enabling Act says that local governments have the authority to cite most things, but they cannot ban a lawful land use for which there is a demonstrated need. Like there's usually some like limits on what local governments can do. And sometimes those are not tested because it's like not everybody wants to be litigious. And so I think that one of the ways that you could build a fair share in is just to make it really clear that If you do not in that kind of context, like you're effectively considered to be unreasonable if you have not if you denied projects even though you have not yet met your fair share allocation. So that's one way that it could work. Um, I'm sure that there are others, but that is the top of my mind.
Great. Thank you. All right. Gonna work our way through some more questions. The next one I think I'm gonna send over to Nelson to answer. Have you seen any correlation between restrictive siting policy and rural, urban, or advantaged/disadvantaged community trends? Anecdotally, in California, we find that some economically disadvantaged communities tend to be more permissive because they are hungry for what they see as economic development, but this can lead to missed opportunities for community benefits. Is this a trend that we see elsewhere?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're hitting on a trend that is common. The communities that tend to adopt the most restrictive policies are communities that are more economically advantaged. That's my understanding of the literature. Um, and but they are still rural communities. So there are rural communities that are restricting or blocking renewable energy projects that have um, that have economic advantages. And yeah, I think that where projects are sited, there is an opportunity to engage with local communities to ensure that they are receiving predictable and substantial benefits from renewable energy projects to account for any local impacts that may be felt. And I think um, some disadvantaged communities may not have the negotiating power that other communities have. And so that's a place where effective policy design can help um, tailor and ensure that those communities have a seat at the table. So that's one way that I think you want to chime in here too.
I was gonna say, is it okay if I chime in?
Absolutely.
So I've been racking my brain to think about whether I've seen actually zoning ordinances linked along with demographic characteristics. And I had like a student do it for a class paper just in Michigan once upon a time. But I don't know that I've seen anything explicitly published about that. And there are a couple, because in part, it's really hard to get all of those zoning ordinances together. And so now that NREL has a more robust data set, we've got data for zoning ordinances in 6 states in the Midwest. We haven't done demographic characteristics. Um, but that's doable. I can't remember anything that I've seen, but I'm kind of behind on reading through the literature. But the question actually reminds me of two papers. One is led up by Eric O'Shaughnessy and a bunch of people within the labs in like 2023, and I can search it to try to find it, that effectively tries to figure out where renewables are going. And effectively, if they're going disproportionately to lower income places or to places that are more or less white. And what they find is, generally speaking, they're like renewables are following the resource availability. Like that's what's really driving it. But the reason that I bring that up is that what I really love in that paper is the discussion section at the end about if you see renewables, like whether you think that's good, that it's not socioeconomically targeting communities, matters about whether you see renewables as a net positive, a net negative, or neutral. And so again, I think that that kind of shapes whether how we might want communities to respond. And I'll just say I was just on a trip and read Matilda Kreider and a bunch of other folks worked on a paper analyzing community benefits mechanisms for wind, where they did some statistical analysis and did find exactly what Nelson was just talking about, that in particular, places that are lower income don't have the ability to negotiate. They're less likely to have negotiated a community benefits mechanism for a wind project. So I think development decisions are largely just where you've got a connection to the grid and where it's windy or sunny, but whether the community is capable of getting the most out of that project, I think depends.
Yeah, and that also makes me think about how I know that there in Michigan, I believe, and some other states, there are some mechanisms in place that ensure that there's like some host community payments that are a part of siting developments, and that also ensure that there's more local economic benefits. We have another question that's also about what's incentivized in state siting policies. This one's asking, do any states advantage renewable project siting using existing degraded lands, sites like brownfields, former industrial lands, completed landfills, and spent quarries and gravel pits? I believe there are a good few examples of that, and I think Nelson or both of you might have answers, but maybe we'll hand it over to Nelson first.
Yeah, I think Sarah and I can tag team this. Yes, this is a common policy that's adopted in states. It's, I think, kind of a best practice. It's worth trying to convert brownfields and disturbed sites or previously used sites where there's been energy production or mining, et cetera, to production for renewable energy, wind, batteries. It's not a silver bullet. It's really hard to, depending on the site, it can be really hard to convert them. There's a lot of remediation that has to happen. My understanding is that there's challenges from a regulatory perspective with like insurance and things like that, but there are programs at the state level and the federal level that help to remediate these sites and prep them for energy production. So yes, this is something that exists and it's common. And I think it's sometimes seen as sort of more of a low-hanging fruit step that states can take.
Yeah,
Sarah?
New York's program stands out. I just
Yeah.
put a link in the chat to some work that my students did trying to help Michigan figure out its brownfield renewable energy program, highlighting the challenges, highlighting the success stories. Again, there's a lot of financial barriers to this, particularly since a lot of brownfields are smaller. And so, like, the web of policies matters in this.
Great. I'm going to turn us to a fair share specific question, getting into some of the weeds here. And I'm going to kind of try and weave two questions together. So one is about when do we establish a fair share cap on renewable energy development? How are we calculating like the footprint for wind energy? Is it the direct footprint under the turbines, or is it the land area that's permitted for wind projects? And then also, how do we incorporate geothermal projects, both at the micro and macro scale? Um, or is this mostly just limited to wind and solar farms? So, Sarah, do you have any ideas on what technologies, what
Well,
metrics?
and this is where, I mean, I think that these are details that would need to be worked out. In places where geothermal is viable, like I don't see why you would not include it. If that's the way that you would be able to, clean up the electric grid, like that makes sense to me. Um, so that's kind of dealing with like which technologies count. Again, maybe it's energy efficiency. Maybe it is actually like really aggressive building codes for brand new housing. So not retrofitting energy like housing after, but like reducing the amount of energy that new building is going to take. And again, those are ways that you can imagine looping in urban and suburban places. On the wind farm one, that is something that I've thought a lot about. Um, I think it is not just the acre that the turbine takes up, but instead kind of the overall catchment area, possibly. Like this is where energy modeling would be really important. I can tell you I've looked into this a little bit in Michigan. We Wind is really helpful, but it is location specific. And so I think if you're establishing a fair share policy, you don't want to disincentivize communities from saying, like, actually, what we really want is wind, because you need those communities in cold environments that might not be super sunny all winter long, to say yes and for their contributions to meaningfully count. And so it could be done on an acre basis. It could be done on a megawatt basis. At least the way we kind of conceptualize something like this in Michigan was how many megawatts do we need overall? And how might we, because solar resource is pretty similar across the state, like how might we divvy that out based on land area, but give people a megawatt target. So I think that there's a couple of different ways to do it, but particularly as you're thinking about including multiple technologies in here, I think that it's helpful to make sure that there's not perverse incentives for one over the other,
Mhm. Yeah.
potentially.
And also maybe there's like an opportunity to pilot this with just one technology, like potentially just solar, and have there be like a fair share allocation for solar as a starting point before trying to expand and like make a comprehensive policy that covers the entire universe of clean energy technologies.
Which is one of the things that we've seen, right, in New Jersey and Maryland. Like those were specific to solar.
Mhm.
Um,
Yep. Cool. We do have a question here on planning that I want to get to since you touched on planning, Sarah. And it's asking, how do you square state planning and modeling exercises with proprietary utility information, like regional planning groups, localities that do not have information about transmission capacity and existing signed contracts? I think I might start off here and just kind of note too, I think something on the planning side of things is when we're asking or when we're incorporating a planning component into fair share policies, I think there's a real opportunity here not to ask local communities to necessarily plan to for how much energy capacity they want to have in their community, but to also consider how, how it might show up in their community. And this might be for the first time. So for them, this is also an exercise in thinking through what are our land use priorities? Where in the community might we want it sited? Do we have ordinance in place that is permissible for solar, for example? What conversations should we be having proactively, maybe even before a project is proposed or cited? And I think that at least creates a more even playing field too for development to happen across a state or a region. But Sarah, I don't know if you have any additional thoughts potentially on this state modeling exercises matched with proprietary utility information.
yeah. I liked your answer, Natalie. I would say I think it's helpful to, again, kind of run what different scenarios might look like, just so have some sense of which, if the state hasn't done this itself, understand like actually if we have clean energy goals, like what does it look like if we do it entirely through solar? What does it look like if we want to include geothermal for the question that was before this? Um, it not every state does know kind of what the capacity is within specific points of interconnect. Again, I know Michigan. This was a study that our Public Service Commission had the transmission utilities do, is to say, like, give us some sense of how many gigawatts each of these substations, each of these lines can take, which is really helpful, I think, towards that planning. And so that's how I would, but I think I really like if you haven't, I mean, I'm usually on the local government side saying like, you should know where a developer wants to go so that you can assess like what your other land use priorities are around your transmission lines, around your substations. How can you reduce barriers to get it to the right places? Or if this is in clear conflict with some other goal that's happening right around that area, like where do you how do you make that those trade-offs and to point it to a different area effectively?
That's awesome. We have lots of questions coming into the chat and only a few minutes left, which time always flies by so quickly. So I'm going to ask we shorten our responses. We can get to like hopefully two or three more questions. And if we don't get to your question, we would love to follow up with you or feel free to reach out to any of us to dive into more detail. So there were a few questions, I think for Nelson, when you were talking about the non-traditional coalitions that you've seen either form to block or support legislation in certain states. Who have you been surprised to see get involved in these conversations?
Yeah, I just threw a response in the
Oh,
chat actually. But so refer there. There's I put two examples in Texas and Louisiana, but this is common across the U.S. that business groups, conservation, environmental groups, renewable energy, clean energy advocates, and renewable energy industry folks are all working together to try to defend against restrictive siting legislation. So, and then a couple examples in the chat. So.
amazing. Thank you so much. All right. Let me see. I know we have one in here that was upvoted a few times on how a fair share might evolve with growing energy demand. Is it 5% of needs, 5% of land that or 5% of land might not be enough in 2030 because of data centers or et cetera. And this is an uncertain time in terms of trying to predict where energy demand is headed. Sarah, any thoughts? I know you've also been thinking a little bit about data centers as well.
I've been thinking way more about data centers than I ever thought. I mean, I think that the reality is what that target is should evolve over time. And also to recognize that when you set the target, you probably want to give yourself some wiggle room, knowing that if you need 2% of the state's land area to meet your, solar goals, like some of that 2% of the land area is going to be incompatible, or you're not going to find a willing landowner. So if it is 2%, saying 5%, it's not wildly different. But I think you would need to come back to this over time as well.
Did we lose? We might have lost Nelson here, but that's okay because we're almost about to wrap up. Um, let's see. I don't know if we have time to sneak in one more question. I know that there was one about where the fair share housing overview I mentioned is. It is buried in the appendix at the end of our paper, which perhaps we can redrop that in the chat if we haven't done so recently, so that everyone has access to it. But I think with that, maybe Sarah, I'll go ahead and begin to wrap us up. That sounds good to you. All right, I'm just going to reshare my screen here for a second, just to say thank you. Um, So thank you all so much for joining us today. Like I said, if we did not get to your question, which there were many questions that we were not able to answer, we would love to continue this conversation with you all and for this to be something that we build off of over time. Please feel free to reach out to myself, Sarah, or Nelson. And we are looking forward to talking this through with you all more. After the end of today's webinar, you'll receive an email with the link to the slides, the link to the paper, and a recording of today's presentation. And then once you exit the webinar, you're also going to get a quick feedback survey request, and we would appreciate it if you take a moment to fill that out to help us shape any future programming we do. And with that, I thank you all again. I hope that you all have wonderful rest of your week as we roll into Thanksgiving. And I hope that next week you all get to and spend some very quality time with your loved ones and eat lots of yummy food. All right. Thanks everyone so much. Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Nelson.